For those unfamiliar with my work, every year I search for the contents of every issue of essentially every English-language nutrition journal in the world, so you don't have to. Of course, there's lots of important nutrition articles published in other journals, cardiology, oncology, pediatrics, internal medicine, so I also search through a number of medical subject headings as well every day. I'm privileged to be biking distance from the National Library of Medicine here next to the nation's capital. Now, anyone can do this. Let's say you like tangerines, and you want to see what's new with your favorite fruit. You can go to pubmed.gov, type in tangerine, press enter, and then click on Save Search, and you can have them email you every time a new article gets published anywhere in the world on the subject of tangerines, free of charge. And while you're waiting for your first tangerine email, you can always catch up on all the tangerine papers previously published in the medical literature, all 7,468 of them. Using my search criteria over the last year, 12,000 articles landed in my inbox. You can usually tell just by looking at the title and abstract if they're interesting, groundbreaking, practical, the criteria I use in picking which studies I'm going to cover each year. This last year, I ended up downloading, categorizing, reading, and analyzing about 3,000 studies, which I turned into 365 videos, so I could post one a day, year-round, to my website, nutritionfacts.org, thanks to the generous support of the Jesse and Julie Rash Foundation. Now, 365 videos is like 12 hours of content, so I have to split it up across multiple discs. Volumes 5 through 8 cover the first 6 hours or so. This DVD you're watching now covers the next chunk, and I expect to release a final 2 DVDs, and then by summer 2012 I'll have another 12,000 articles in my inbox, and we'll do it all again. Even though you have the DVD, I do encourage everyone to check out nutritionfacts.org. It has all the videos from all my old DVDs posted online, completely free. It's the first and only non-commercial, science-based website to provide free daily video updates on the latest discoveries in nutrition. It has hundreds of videos on more than 1,000 different topics, and a new video is uploaded every day. You can rate videos, share videos, search videos, discuss videos. I have links to all the sources, so you can read the original scientific papers yourself, make up your own mind. You can ask me questions, you can read my blog, you can follow the site on Twitter, you can follow the site on Facebook, so you can share this potentially life-changing, life-saving information with those you care about the most. The standard American diet is in a sad state, but sadder in some states than others. The CDC recently released a survey to chart our progress on fruit and vegetable consumption, and if you can even imagine, we're eating even fewer fruits and vegetables than we were a decade ago. Not a single state met the goals they were hoping for, but one, and only one, state did make an improvement at least. Can you guess which one? Here's all 50. Note the deepest, darkest color represents 35% to 44.9%. So not a single state even hit 50% for eating 2 fruit a day, with Oklahoma doing the worst. And for vegetables, not one state even had a third of their population eating 3 daily servings of vegetables, and less than 1 in 5 people in South Dakota. The CDC goal was to get all states up to 75% eating servings of fruits and 50% veggies by 2010, and not even close. And those eating both, forget about it. Though I am impressed with New Englanders and their fruit. Caucasians ate the least fruit, Hispanics the least vegetables, and the one state, the only state to improve over the decade, Idaho, which just made it to blue. A review was published recently on domoic acid, a potent neurotoxin found extremely rarely in seafood that can cause seizures, coma, death, like the paralytic fish toxins, but most interestingly causes amnesia, permanent short-term memory loss. If anyone's seen the movie Memento, that's what they're talking about, anterograde amnesia. So here's kind of a prototypical case. Prior to muscle ingestion, the patient was entirely self-sufficient small business owner. After supper, he started to get nauseous, up all night vomiting, but then he started to really deteriorate. 10 days later, he's in a coma on a ventilator, but then he recovers. 3 months later, he's back. Normal language, judgment, social skills. Didn't know where he was or what day it was. In fact, doesn't remember anything since getting sick, and from then on was unable to retain any new information, though he could remember everything in his life before that fateful meal. The toxin targets the hippocampus, the part of the brain where memories are laid down. Years later, when he died, at the autopsy there was complete neuronal loss, nerve loss, in that part of the brain. This amnesic seafood toxin has been found in tuna, anchovies, mackerel, sole, sardines, halibut, and the diatoms that produce the original toxin that bioaccumulates up the food chain into the fish appear to be increasing in frequency and toxicity, thereby presenting a continued threat to human health and seafood safety. The toxin is heat stable, so it's clear that cooking will not increase the safety of the products contaminated with domoic acid. It does cross the placenta, can enter the brain tissue, and accumulate in amniotic fluid, so particular concern lies in infants and children that may be exposed. The source for the New York City water supply was recently tested for the occurrence of pharmaceutical and personal care products. As I talked about in one of my previous videos, many of the drugs we take are excreted in our urine and can end up polluting our waterways. What about New York City? They found trace amounts of drugs like Tylenol, ibuprofen, stimulants like nicotine, caffeine, hormones like estrone and testosterone, some antibiotics, barbiturate, Valium. The levels they found were extremely low, though, well under the New York safety standards. Now, some may question the standards, like the caffeine standard was set at 50 milligrams a liter, or quart. You could get 50 milligrams drinking a half cup of coffee, and look, lots of people drink a lot more than half a cup, so they understandably consider that level safe, but you may not want to have that much coming out of your tap. But again, none of these drugs even came close to those limits. The concern is bioaccumulation. Does it build up in the flesh of fish swimming in it? Well, in a national study of the occurrence of pharmaceuticals and personal care products in fish, they did find, for example, Prozac metabolites in fish fillets at levels higher than found in the surrounding water. But before you consider eating fish to improve your mood, know that these drugs are mostly concentrated in the brains of the fish. And a recent Harvard study looked at fish consumption and depression, the Harvard Nurses study, and their findings do not support a protective effect of the long-chain omega-3s in fish on depression risk, though they do support the hypothesis that higher ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, the plant-based omega-3 found in flax seeds and walnuts, may reduce depression risk. Another surprising fish story out of Massachusetts recently: atrial fibrillation is the most common clinical cardiac arrhythmia, an irregularity of our heartbeat rhythm, which can set you up for a stroke, increase our risk of dementia and heart failure, and significantly shorten our lifespan. Previous findings on the effect of diet have been conflicting. Some studies have found alcohol, caffeine, and fish consumption to be good in terms of preventing and resolving atrial fibrillation, and other studies have shown them all to be bad. It's when this kind of situation arises in nutritional science, you'll pull out the big guns and put it to the test in one of the bigger, better studies, like the famous Framingham Heart Study population, like they did here. They found no effect either way in general from the consumption of alcohol, caffeine, or fish, but when they looked closer, they observed an association between the consumption of dark fish and atrial fibrillation, a 6-fold higher hazard ratio. What they're talking about is basically salmon, swordfish, bluefish, mackerel, sardines, that kind of thing. They conclude that their findings may suggest a true adverse effect of dark fish and fish oil on certain subtypes of atrial fibrillation, proposing that potential toxins such as dioxins and methylmercury accumulated in certain fish may have a negative effect on cardiac arrhythmia. because, as editorialized in the Journal of Pediatrics last year, almost all fish contain some mercury, women who plan on getting pregnant may want to first get tested for mercury. Due to the considerable uncertainty, they show that specific guidelines for number of servings of fish, which are quote-unquote safe for women of reproductive age, may not be sufficiently specific to practically prevent fetal risk. So they conclude an analysis of hair mercury may be warranted before pregnancy in women who eat a lot of fish. It's a simple test. All they need is a hair sample, because mercury contaminates your whole body when you eat it. The reason they're so concerned is because they found that even at the number of fish servings recommended by the FDA as safe, there were women with hair mercury levels above the lowest observable adverse effect level of 0.3. And some questioned the federal safety limits. A recent review from researchers at Harvard and elsewhere on the adverse effects of methylmercury notes that the U.S. EPA limit suggests an adult should be exposed to no more than 50 micrograms. But if that's the case, then seafood better contain less than 0.1 per gram, and current regulations in the United States and the European Union allow up to 10 times as much mercury in fish as the EPA limit allows. And they go on to criticize the EPA safety limit as being way too high itself. They argue that thus, based on new data, the exposure limits estimated by the U.S. EPA and international bodies would need to be halved. So are fishes allowed to have 20 times more mercury than may be considered safe? No mercury level may be truly safe. This review on the adverse effects of mercury in fish suggested that even slightly increased environmental exposure to methylmercury from fish could lead to adverse effects on nervous system development, just like lead exposure. No lead is the only good lead, and the same is true for mercury. They point to this famous study, published in the Journal of Pediatrics a few years ago, showing delayed brainstem auditory evoked potential latencies in teens exposed to methylmercury as an objective measure of neurobehavioral toxicity in 14-year-old children with developmental exposure to methylmercury from fish. It's a measure of how well the nerves in your brain communicate. You take kids, you stick electrodes on their scalp and headphones on their ears, and play a quick sound, and then just measure how long it takes for that sound to be transmitted from the nerves in their ear to the auditory cortex in their brain. The longer the delay, the slower your nerve impulses are traveling. And so here's the graph. Right? This is delay versus mercury content in their hair. You'll notice two things. The more mercury the kids had in their bodies, the longer the delay. That's bad. Also, you'll notice it's basically a straight line. It doesn't plateau out at the bottom end. The lower the mercury, the better. Where do the official safety limits fit on this graph? In 1978, the World Health Organization started to realize how dangerous mercury was, so they said, no greater than this level is safe. We didn't know any better. Decades later, the quote-unquote safe upper limit was moved down to here. Right? Our government said, no way, our children are much too precious for that, and placed our upper limit here in 2001. As you can plainly see from this later data, though, if you push levels lower, get people to eat less fish, you get even less brain damage. Yet as of 2012, the safety limit remains there. As one former EPA toxicologist told the Wall Street Journal, government regulators really consider the fish industry to be their clients rather than the U.S. public. Are there some brands of tuna worse than others? An evaluation of mercury concentrations in 3 national brands of canned tuna was undertaken recently. In total, they found that 55% of all tuna examined was above the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's safety limit for human consumption. And mercury is not just a problem for children. As I've noted in videos over the years, the health effects resulting from consumption of methylmercury for adults are considerable. It may include central nervous system damage, ataxia, paresthesia, hearing loss, diminishing vision, loss of sensation in extremities, and loss of consciousness leading to death. Due to the increased susceptibility of the developing nervous system, though, Damages are more pronounced in fetuses, infants, and children, and may include microcephaly, which is a shrunken brain, delayed development, impaired cognition, and gross neurological disorders. Given the average level of mercury pollution found in canned tuna, they suggest that your average 9-year-old would exceed the EPA limit eating any more than a can of tuna every 43 days. This is not the first study of canned tuna. Previous studies going back nearly 20 years found levels of mercury that were bad, but not as bad as the ones found now. The problem of mercury in tuna appears to be getting worse and worse. But which brand was the worst? National brand number 3 contains significantly more mercury than the other two, but they failed to disclose which brand was which. They wouldn't say. All they said was that these results indicate that stricter regulation of the canned tuna industry is necessary to ensure the safety of sensitive populations such as pregnant women, infants, and children. How many times has this happened to you? You're in a natural food store, walking near the supplements section, and an employee graciously offers advice, asks if you need any help. Very kind of them, but I'm always left wondering how these people were trained. Were they trained? Do they have any idea what they're talking about? So I was delighted to learn that that very question was the subject of multiple studies spanning a decade. Health food store recommendations for breast cancer patients. A researcher posing as a daughter of a breast cancer patient went into 40 health food stores asking for their recommendations on cancer care. 36 out of 40 stores tried to sell them something. Understandable, that's their job. But 95% didn't even ask a single question about their mom or her diagnosis before recommending 38 different types of products, at an annual cost of between $300 and $3,000. The most common recommendation was shark cartilage, apparently found effective at causing nausea, fever, dizziness, life-threatening hypercalcemia, and liver failure, but effective at little else. The same study was repeated up in Canada. Health food store recommendations, implications for breast cancer patients. 34 stores, 33 different products, one of which cost $18,000 a year. One of the fake patients was even told to stop the tamoxifen. She said she'd been prescribed a drug credited for playing a large part in decreasing breast cancer mortality over the last 30 years. You'll notice on foods and supplements that it's actually illegal to claim they can prevent or cure disease. That's why you'll just see these so-called structure and function claims, like supports immunity. And federal law basically prohibits people from diagnosing and prescribing without a medical license. You can probably walk into any health food store and get all the claims, diagnosing, and prescribing you could ever want. And the question is, how good is that advice? Health information provided by retail health food outlets. What if you go in and pretend your 6-year-old just got diagnosed with Crohn's disease? 23 stores, 30 different recommendations, including a myriad of untried and perhaps deleterious treatments. What kind of training did these health food store employees get? Most got absolutely none, or in-store training only. It's no secret that I've been very critical of drug companies biasing medical training. That was much of what my first book on medical education was about. But what do we think stores are teaching their employees to say? Clinic at the health food store? This one says more about the supplement industry itself than health food stores. Researchers went in feigning depression, and most were given St. John's wort supplements, though at wildly varying doses, without mentioning the significant drug reactions and side effects like photosensitivity. Still, at least they were vaguely consistent with their recommendations. What was not consistent was the level of the active ingredient, hypericin, promised on the labels. 90% were wildly off, including 2 of the 13 they tested that had none at all. In the United States, dietary supplements are a multi-billion-dollar industry. Right? That's by probably 10 times less than what we spend on prescription drugs, but still tens of billions of dollars is no small potatoes. Many of us rightly rail against the political influence and commercial bias of the pharmaceutical industry, but are we to assume multi-million-dollar supplement corporations are any less self-interested? Sometimes the advice on dietary supplements people are given is worse than worthless. HIV patients seeking advice from health food stores. 26 stores recommended 36 different products, including some, like garlic, that can critically interfere with certain HIV meds. When the FDA and Health Canada issued advisory warnings to stop taking the herb kava kava due to one too many cases of fatal liver toxicity, it didn't seem to affect things much in health food stores. What about health food stores' recommendations for nausea and migraines during pregnancy? Would health food store employees recommend supplements contraindicated in pregnancy that could cause significant harm to the mother and/or fetus? You betcha. And what kills me is that there are pregnancy-safe supplements for nausea, like powdered ginger, which may be effective, yet they were instead advised to take a long list of untested things, including herbs like feverfew and black cohosh, which can cause uterine contractions and possible miscarriage. Yes, as we've seen, studies have shown over and over again that health food store employees on average didn't know what the heck they were talking about, but maybe nobody does when it comes to supplements. 2 North American studies were recently published, one in Canada, one here in the States, comparing the advice gotten from health food stores compared to community pharmacies. In Canada, researchers went in and asked questions like, will ginseng give me more energy? Will beta-carotene help me prevent cancer? Will shark cartilage help cure my cancer? What percentage of visits to 192 different health food stores were researchers given advice considered accurate, or at least fairly accurate, based on the balance of available scientific evidence? 100% of the time? Half the time? No. 7% of the time. Pharmacists did about 10 times better. In the U.S. study, they got actors to walk into pharmacies and health food stores feigning classic symptoms of type 1 diabetes: excessive thirst and fatigue, unexplained weight loss despite overeating, peeing like crazy all the time. They asked the health food and pharmacy staff what they thought they had, what they should take, and whether they thought they should go see a doctor. Given that type 1 diabetes can be fatal if untreated, the answer to that last question is yes, they should indeed go see a doctor. And all 8 out of the 8 pharmacists got that right. Good for them. But only half, 6 of the 12 health food store employees, thought it necessary, and 2 of the 6 naysayers explicitly advised against going to a doctor, the rationale being that the physician would, quote, just give them Ritalin, or miss the true diagnosis, which they felt was something like mold infestation or adrenal exhaustion, which luckily they had just the right supplements for at a bargain for only up to $200 a month. An editorial was recently published decrying much of the multi-billion-dollar marketing of dietary supplements in North America as misleading, deceptive, even predatory. After examining hundreds of sales claims made when supplements are being marketed over the years, the author concluded dishonesty or wild exaggerations are frequent occurrences in the marketing of supplements. My favorite quote was, "The marketers of supplements like to use scientific evidence the way a drunk uses a lamppost, more for support than illumination." This is nothing new. Similar editorials have been published in the Journal of the AMA and the New England Journal of Medicine. What made this one special was that it was, to their credit, published in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine. It's like their own journal admitting it. In response, the head of global supplement initiatives at Novus, which actually started out as the livestock feed additives division of Monsanto, before branching off into human feed additives, dietary supplements, starts his rebuttal with this counterpoint. In his review, entitled The Marketing of Dietary Supplements in North America, the Emperor is Almost Naked, the author may be mortified to know the Emperor is still dancing in the street, dressed or not, to the tune of $68 billion. This figure is much higher, and is a much more relevant number than cited, indicating a very strong and respectable commerce. That's his first argument, that it's highly lucrative? He goes on to say that, hey, they're safer than some pharmaceutical drugs, but how much is that saying, given that prescription drugs kill an estimated 106,000 Americans every year? And that's not errors, not abuse, not overdose. That's just deaths from side effects, ADRs, adverse drug reactions, which would make doctors, me and my fellow colleagues, the fourth leading cause of death in the United States. So for the supplement industry to say, hey, at least we're not the fourth leading cause of death, isn't saying much. The Consumers Union, publishers of Consumer Reports, recently celebrated its 75-year anniversary. They were among the first to point out the risks of smoking, the toxic effects of ephedra weight loss supplements. Well, one of their latest investigations questions the safety of protein powders in drinks. They concluded that we don't need the extra protein or the heavy metals their tests found. They sent 15 protein supplements off to an outside lab to test for toxic compounds such as arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury, and found that the amount of lead in a single daily serving of 8 out of the 15 protein supplements they tested would require that the products carry a warning in California under their Prop 65 law for toxin-containing substances. So athletes should get the lead out by choosing whole food sources of nutrition. A triad of new studies showing once again that those taking dietary supplements may, in some cases, be paying to make themselves sick. They're all pretty self-explanatory. High intake of folate from food sources like beans and greens associated with reduced risk of esophageal cancer. In contrast, high intake of folic acid from supplements associated with significantly elevated risk of Barrett's esophagus with precancerous changes. Dietary intakes of carotenoids and vitamin C, like eating carrots, sweet potatoes, greens, broccoli, citrus, associated with decreased odds of lower urinary tract infections in men, but not supplemental intakes. Those taking nutrients in pill form, in fact, got worse. Unless your pills look like this. Green tea good, green tea supplements bad. There's no longer reasonable doubt that ingestion of concentrated extracts of Chinese green tea poses a real and growing risk to liver health. In one of my videos a few years ago, I talked about a study that examined the food safety practices of restaurant workers in several fast food chains in the Midwest, finding an astounding 0% compliance with federal food code guidelines for hand washing. Well, a follow-up study was recently published on the food safety practices in retail deli departments. They looked at both independent and chain stores. How do you think they did overall? Did they wash their hands 10% of the times they were supposed to, 50% of the time? For example, did they wash their hands after touching bare body parts, before they touched the meat? And the answer is they washed their hands 11% of the time. Better than the cynic in me expected, but still only about 1 in 10 times did they wash their hands when they were supposed to, though it was 1 in 50 at the independent stores. Only 2% compliance with hand washing. The chain stores actually did better. Why is this important? Consider this case report of occupational transmission of hepatitis C virus resulting from use of the same supermarket meat slicer. 2 women worked in the same deli department, one Hep C positive, something usually only transmitted by sharing dirty needles, unless you're using a common ham-cutting machine with frequent bleeding hand injuries, and then one Hep C positive woman can become 2. In previous years, I've talked about the potential to contract hepatitis from a virus in pork, but this time at least it wasn't the pig's fault. The reason food service workers are supposed to wear gloves is that they could potentially pick up an infection touching a public surface like a doorknob or faucet, and then transfer it to our food. Well, if touching common surfaces could contaminate your hands, what about money? Dirty money, an investigation into the hygiene status of some of the world's currencies as obtained from food outlets. A total of 1,280 banknotes were obtained from food outlets in 10 different countries. and their bacterial count was enumerated. Who had the most contaminated money? They looked at Australia, Burkina Faso in Africa, China, Ireland, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Nigeria, Mexico, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Here's the graph. Note this is a log scale, so this is like 100-fold difference in bacterial contamination. Let's do the cleanest ones first. Which country has the most hygienic dollar? That's a hint, as only 3 of the countries use quote-unquote dollars: the United States and our winner, Australia, along with runner-up New Zealand. The most contaminated belongs to China, though not all bacteria are the same. If you're just looking at E. coli, for example, as an indicator of fecal contamination, then looking at the white bar, we're number 1, leading the world at 55% of our bills contaminated with E. coli, with Burkina Faso, the 3rd least developed country in the world, a close second. They recommend that the handling of food and money should be physically separated by employing different individuals to carry out one task each, or handling food only with a gloved hand and the money with the other hand, or if neither of these precautions can be effectively implemented, it is highly recommended that food service personnel practice proper hand-washing procedures after handling money and before handling food. Let me start by saying this one is not for the squeamish. For years I've shared many a foodborne malady. When people think foodborne illness, they tend to think of tummy flu, not toxic megacolon, or sexually transmitted fish toxins, or any of the other bizarre case reports I run across of things one can contract at the dinner table. Well, published recently in the official CDC journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases, I think I found something that takes the cake. It wasn't the sushi worm found living in someone's stomach, or a swallowed fish bone that came poking out. No, it was Linguatula serrata, tongue worm in human eye. Evidently, if we prefer our viscera poorly cooked, we can swallow eggs that hatch in our intestines into worm-like blood-sucking parasites that burrow out through the intestinal wall and then migrate throughout our body. Rarely they can tunnel into the eye, and when they say tongue worm in human eye, they mean like literally swimming around inside the eyeball. And yes, they've got video.
Linguatula serrata tongueworm in human eye, Austria. A close-up of a light-colored left eye is seen. Only the eyeball and the edges of the eyelid are visible. There are 2 bright spots of light shining into the eye. The upper lid is lifted to show a very bloodshot white of the eye. The lid is lowered, and then visible inside the eye on the lower right is a wriggling worm. Another worm then appears in the upper left, inside the eyeball itself.
The 3rd leading cause of foodborne disease-related death in the United States, after Salmonella and the meat-borne brain parasite Toxoplasma, is Listeria, a type of foodborne bacteria that has the rare ability to survive and thrive in a cold, acidic, salty environment, otherwise known as deli meats, hot dogs, and refrigerated ready-to-eat chicken and turkey products. The fatality rate of the infection is 20 to 30%, making it the most dangerous foodborne bacteria in the American meat supply. Unable to rid itself of the bug, the U.S. meat industry petitioned the FDA to allow them to use a novel pathogen control strategy, virulent bacteriophage, for efficient biocontrol of Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat foods, or as the FDA touted in one of its publications, bacteria-eating virus, approved as food additive. Not all viruses harm people. The FDA has approved a mixture of viruses as a food additive to protect people. The additive can be used in processing plants for spraying onto ready-to-eat meat and poultry products to protect consumers from the potentially life-threatening bacterium Listeria. Not all bacteria harm people either, and so concern has been expressed that the viruses on our meat could also infect and kill the good bacteria in our gut. But they appear to be extremely species-specific, and so the main concern has been the possibility of the viruses spreading toxin genes between bacteria, especially considering the difficulties in preventing large numbers of viruses from being released into the environment. It could also allow the industry to become even more complacent about food safety. If they know they can just spray some viruses on at the end, kind of similar to the quick fix argument about irradiation. From the industry point of view, who cares if there's fecal contamination of the meat, as long as it's sterilized feces, sterilized at the end with enough radiation. Recently, researchers discovered that you can feed the viruses to the chickens directly, put viruses right in the feed, and obtain the same effect. They conclude that the phage cocktail administered in feed can be easily and successfully used under commercial condition in a poultry unit. Another important aspect of the present study is that the phages that composed the cocktail were isolated from poultry carcasses. Their use to reduce bacterial colonization in live birds would not introduce any new biological entity into the food chain, meaning consumers shouldn't complain about the use of viruses as a biological control agent, since the viruses are on the meat to begin with. The meat industry is concerned that consumers might be wary of meat sprayed with bacteria-eating viruses. Consumer acceptance of bacteriophage usage may present something of a challenge to the food industry. If they think they're going to have consumer acceptance issues with spreading viruses on meat, that's nothing compared to an even more novel technique to preserve meat: the effect of extracted housefly pupae peptide mixture on chilled pork preservation. Yes, that's what you think it means. You smear a maggot mixture on the meat. It is considered a low-cost and simple method. Think about it. Maggots thrive on rotting meat, yet there have been no reports that housefly larvae have any serious diseases, indicating that they have a strong immune system. They must be packed with some sort of antibacterial properties, otherwise they'd get infected and die themselves. So they took maggots who were 3 days old, washed them, dried them, toweled them off, put them through a blender, filtered out the solids, and voila! The housefly can easily be produced on a large scale with simple techniques at a low cost, and the best part? After the extraction of the housefly pupae peptide mixture, the maggot remains can be used as protein foodstuffs, thereby increasing our protein supply. It's a win-win. Some parasites are real, and some are not. Delusional parasitosis, it's a form of psychosis characterized by the false belief that you're infested with some sort of parasite. It can be triggered by a variety of brain diseases, such as schizophrenia, dementia, due to vitamin B12 deficiency, stroke. Tragic case report of a woman who suddenly started repeatedly washing her clothes with bleach until she ruined them, scratching her whole body up. She was hospitalized, persistently expressing her delusions of parasitosis. They did an MRI, and what did they find causing these delusions? An actual pork tapeworm in her brain. A tragic case that was tragically ironic. The first report of brain parasitosis as an underlying neurological condition in delusional parasitosis. Most of the U.S. population suffers an acute diarrheal illness every year, and according to a recent survey, most people correctly identified food as the most common source, but fewer than half, 45%, believed it's legal for grocery stores to sell meat with food-poisoning bacteria on it. It must be illegal, right? I mean, you can't sell unsafe cars, you can't sell unsafe toys. How could they possibly sell unsafe meat? Yet it's totally legal for most food-poisoning bugs. They do it by blaming the consumer. As USDA poultry microbiologist Nelson Cox said, raw meats are not idiot-proof. They can be mishandled, and when they are, it's like handling a hand grenade. If you pull the pin, someone's going to get hurt. See, if we get sick, it's our fault, not the meat industry for selling meat contaminated with crap. While some may question the wisdom of selling hand grenades in the supermarket, the USDA poultry expert disagrees. I think the consumer has the most responsibility, but refuses to accept it. It's like a car company saying, yeah, we installed faulty brakes, but it's your fault for not putting your kid in a seatbelt. Patricia Griffin, director of epidemiological research at the Centers for Disease Control, responded famously to this kind of blame-the-victim attitude. Is it reasonable, she asked of the meat industry, that if a consumer undercooks a hamburger, their 3-year-old dies? According to the latest published National Retail Meat Report, more than 80% of retail chicken breasts sold in the United States are contaminated with fecal matter, up from about 70% 7 years before. 80% fecal contamination, and that's completely legal. But there are a few bugs for which there is zero tolerance. That does not make the meat industry happy. As the president of the Seafood Importers and Processors Association wrote in their article, Beyond Zero Tolerance, a new approach to food safety, they propose a risk-based approach instead of a precautionary approach. From a recent article about raw poultry, instead of zero tolerance, alternative terminology should be used, such as acceptable or tolerable risk. Instead of zero tolerance policies on potentially deadly bacteria on chicken, they propose ALOP, an appropriate level of protection, an acceptable risk, a certain number of cases per 100,000 population per year associated with a specific hazard in a particular food commodity. Given the nature of the poultry industry, controls that are currently applied will not guarantee the absence of salmonella from raw poultry. It's just the way we raise chickens. Therefore, using terms such as zero tolerance or absence of a microbe in relation to raw poultry should therefore be avoided. The plaques in our coronary arteries, which can eventually burst, shut off our heart's blood supply, and kill us, are more aptly described as pimples, not plaques. They are inflamed pockets of pus, and it all starts with cholesterol. This is a diagram of the wall of the coronary arteries crowning our heart. And here comes the villain of the story, LDL, the bad cholesterol, infiltrating the lining of our artery. It gets oxidized and triggers an inflammatory response. Your artery hangs a white towel out the window into the bloodstream, asking for help. The lining of your artery actually produces adhesion molecules to stick white blood cells, called monocytes, zooming past, and suck them into the wall to try to repair some of the havoc cholesterol is wreaking. We never evolved to have so much cholesterol in our bloodstream, and it causes damage and inflammation inside the walls of our arteries. Other inflammatory cells are called into action, and it gets pussier and more inflamed, and turns into a big whitehead sticking out like a zit into the blood flow inside our arteries. The blood's pulsating past and can rip off the cap, and you get a big squirt of pus straight into your artery. Blood rushes into the hole and says, hey, we know how to plug holes, and forms a blood clot, also known as a thrombus, that can close off the whole rest of the artery. And then we have the opportunity to visualize a cross-section like this of an artery on autopsy, because you're dead. The best way to prevent a massive heart attack, to prevent atherosclerosis, is to start at step number 1, blocking the buildup of cholesterol, which is a direct result of having too much LDL cholesterol in our bloodstream, which is a direct result of eating 3 things. Number 1, saturated fat, found mostly in meat, dairy, and eggs. Number 2, trans fat, found mostly in processed junk and animal products in the American diet. Number 3, the consumption of cholesterol itself from meat, dairy, and especially eggs. Elevated LDL cholesterol levels is also caused, as we've seen, by the lack of consumption of fiber, found in all whole plant foods. Since we evolved to eat enormous quantities of fiber, when we don't, our LDL ends up much higher than it's supposed to be. Since all plants have fiber, and all animal saturated fat and cholesterol, in general, all whole plant foods tend to lower our risk of dying from our number one killer, and all whole animal foods tend to raise our risk. There are, however, processed plant foods that do raise cholesterol, hydrogenated vegetable oil, for example, and processed animal foods that don't, skim milk and egg whites. In animal models, animal proteins alone increase cholesterol. But in people, it's more the animal fat and cholesterol, or at least in adults. There was a study of 1 to 3-year-olds that found that swapping in wheat protein for milk protein dramatically lowered cholesterol, and then when they went back to milk protein, it rose back up again. But as the researchers admit, they couldn't completely control for the cholesterol. The use of the milk protein casein precludes the preparation of a cholesterol-free diet. Cholesterol and animal products go hand in hand. Just as it's hard to create a plant-based diet without some fiber slipping in, even when they try to feed kids on white flour instead of whole wheat. Bottom line, to block that first step of heart disease, we need to eat more plants, less animals, because that means more fiber and less saturated fat and cholesterol. We've covered how to prevent the first step of atherosclerosis, decrease the level of bad cholesterol in our blood. What about blocking some of these other steps downstream? Both common and specialty mushrooms inhibit adhesion molecule expression and in vitro binding of monocytes to human aortic endothelial cells in a pro-inflammatory environment. So that means mushrooms may help block both this step and this step. Basically, what these researchers at Arizona State did was take the lining of a human artery, soak it overnight with either nothing, the control group, or shiitake mushrooms, crimini mushrooms, oyster mushrooms, maitake mushrooms, or plain white button mushrooms. Then they took away the mushrooms, washed the artery off, and then added some monocytes before and after inflammation. So what we'd like to see is these bars come down, less monocyte adhesion. So instead of being sucked into the walls of our arteries, they can go off and do their business elsewhere. Which mushroom do you think worked the best? They all worked, but in another victory for this little fungi, plain old cheap white button mushrooms worked the best. And under inflammatory conditions, they found the same thing, but shiitake didn't even seem to work much at all. The health implications are that diverse mushrooms, including common and specialty mushrooms, can protect against cardiovascular disease by interfering with events that contribute to atherogenesis. Chamomile is one of the oldest widely used medicinal plants in the world. A recent review suggests there's scientific evidence supporting its use against inflammation, cancer, the common cold, heart disease, diarrhea, eczema, ulcers, hemorrhoids, mouth ulcers, osteoporosis, insomnia, anxiety, diabetes, sore throat, vaginitis, wounds, and the kitchen sink. Safety in young children, pregnant or nursing women, or those with liver or kidney disease has not been established, although there have not been any credible reports of toxicity caused by this common tea beverage. Well, now there is. See, chamomile is a powerful anti-inflammatory agent, and that's the problem. There's a reason pregnant women are not supposed to take anti-inflammatory drugs like aspirin. Premature constriction of the fetal ductus arteriosus following the maternal consumption of chamomile herbal tea. The researchers observed 2 cases of premature ductal closure associated with maternal consumption of chamomile tea, which can be associated with serious fetal complications. The good news, if it's caught early and the herbal tea is stopped, the condition can be reversed. In the second case, though, they had to do an emergency cesarean. We would advocate caution, the researchers conclude, in regular consumption of chamomile tea during pregnancy. At one of the farmers' markets I go to, there's a farmer with a hydroponic greenhouse, such that I can get fresh basil all year round. But I was always curious how hydroponic basil, grown in water, compared nutritionally to basil grown in soil. Well, here we go. Same seeds, one in water, one in soil. What do you think they found in terms of vitamin content, antioxidant content, and phytonutrient content? The hydroponic basil won hands down. More antioxidant power, more vitamins, key phytonutrients. Why? Because the basil doesn't like it. It's the same reason organic greens are healthier. They get bitten by bugs, and in defense, they manufacture more of those wonderful glucosinolate compounds that are so good for us. Likewise, under environmental stress, drowning in the water, basil may release these phenolic antioxidant phytochemicals, like rosmarinic acid, to protect itself, and we can reap the benefits. As we age, our immune system starts to decline. That's why when you hear infectious disease advisories, they often list those at greatest risk include infants, the immunocompromised, and the elderly, because the elderly are, to some extent, immunocompromised. Recently, researchers in Belfast reported an investigation into the possibility that inadequate diet may be a contributing factor to immunological aging. Both immunity and fruit and vegetable intake can be low in the elderly, so they wondered if there might be a connection. So they rounded up 83 volunteers between 65 and 95 years of age, and randomized them into the control group following their pitiful 2 or fewer servings of fruits and vegetables a day diet, versus the experimental group that were told to consume at least 5. They did this for a month before they were due for their pneumonia vaccine. The experimental group didn't quite hit 5 daily servings, but at least they did better than the control group. Here's what happened when they were given Pneumovax. Here's the immune response in the control group. They were injected with pneumonia bacteria vaccine. Their immune systems should have gone crazy making antibodies to fight off the perceived invader, and they tried their best. But this is the group that was on almost 5 servings of fruits and veggies every day for the prior 4 weeks. Influenza and pneumonia constitute the 7th leading cause of death for our elderly. It's never too late to start eating healthier. From a recent review on diet and inflammation by Dr. Leo Galland, who, when I was a kid, actually used to be my doctor. Inflammation has recently emerged as an important aspect of the development of age-related infirmity and the major chronic diseases of industrialized societies— heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, cancer. And we have markers of inflammation now, like C-reactive protein, which are easy to measure and give a sense of how much inflammation there is in our bodies, which is predictive for the development of some of these diseases. We know plant-based food in general have anti-inflammatory effects, particularly fruits and vegetables, but not all plant foods. From a 2010 review, extra virgin olive oil decreases inflammatory markers compared to corn oil or non-virgin oil. Tomato juice helps, but raw tomatoes don't appear to. Walnuts, red wine, and flax meal work. Garlic powder doesn't. Mixed data on tea, but sweet cherries do seem to decrease inflammation. There have since been a few new studies to add to this list, one showing that those eating just 4 servings of legumes a week— lentils, chickpeas, peas, beans— dropped C-reactive protein levels a whopping 40% in 2 months. And then, apparently the first study ever to address the effects of potato consumption on oxidation and inflammation in humans was published. And not just any potatoes, there's all sorts of new varieties out there. First, though, they looked at regular potatoes, white russet potatoes. 1 steamed potato a day for 6 weeks. Inflammation, as measured by C-reactive protein levels in the blood, tended to go up. Next, potatoes with yellow flesh did a bit better, but neither were significantly different than baseline. Only purple potatoes, potatoes with purple flesh, significantly decreased inflammation. And same thing was found for oxidation. In this 2012 study, within hours of consumption, purple potatoes increased the antioxidant capacity of one's bloodstream, whereas white potato starch appeared to have a pro-oxidant effect. And purple potatoes also appeared to help lower blood pressure in folks with hypertension. They put people on 6 to 8 small microwave purple potatoes a day, and concluded purple potatoes are an effective hypotensive agent and lower the risk of heart disease and stroke in hypertensive subjects without weight gain. Combined with a reduction in inflammation and DNA damage, purple potatoes offer consumers an improved nutritional choice in potato consumption. Do all these anti-inflammatory plant foods actually have an impact on inflammatory disease mortality, though? A recent study out of Australia reported the results of following about 2,500 older adults and their diets for 15 years. During that time, about 200 died of inflammatory diseases, and so the researchers tried to calculate what it was about the diets of the survivors that seemed to help the most, and it was nuts. Half a walnut a day appeared to cut the risk of dying from inflammatory disease in about half. In the study, increasing the consumption of nuts by as little as 1.4 grams a day, that's about half the weight of a penny, was associated with a reduced 49% risk of dying from chronic inflammation-related diseases. That's like 1 almond a day. Fish consumption didn't seem to do a thing. Our data indicates a protective role of nuts, but not fish, against inflammatory disease mortality. This may help explain why most studies done to date on those eating vegetarian or vegan show significantly less inflammation in their bodies compared to meat eaters. There have been a dozen studies so far. 4 showed no significant difference, and 8 showed significantly less inflammatory markers in those eating vegetarian. Here's the latest. A vegetarian diet was associated with lower inflammation levels, lower levels of C-reactive protein, which is in accordance with research showing vegetarians have a lower risk of heart disease and improved antioxidant and inflammatory status. We know plant-based diets decrease markers of inflammation, but to see if plant-based diets decrease inflammation in a clinically relevant way, you've got to put it to the test. The gold standard for evidence in nutritional science is an interventional trial. You split people up into 2 groups, put half on one diet, half on the other, see what happens. Inflammatory bowel diseases, such as Crohn's disease, is an autoimmune condition where your immune system attacks your own intestines. There's no cure. All you can do is try to keep it in remission as long as possible between attacks. Sufferers are often put on anti-inflammatory and immunosuppressive drugs, and may find themselves in and out of the hospital getting segments of their intestines surgically removed. Since it's the intestine itself that's inflamed, that would seem to be a good condition to test out the anti-inflammatory power of plant-based diets. We've known that meat, cheese, fish, animal protein in general has been found to increase risk of developing inflammatory bowel disease. But what about plants to not just prevent, but treat it? Japanese researchers took a group of Crohn's patients in remission, either because they just came out of surgery, or they were able to beat it back with steroids, and for 2 years asked half of them to eat a semi-vegetarian diet, meaning in this case vegetarian, except for half a serving of fish a week and a half a serving of other meat once every 2 weeks. But otherwise, they were supposed to eat vegetarian, less than 1 serving of meat per week. Now, this wasn't a prison study or anything. They were free-living adults, so the results are not necessarily what happens when Crohn's sufferers actually go on a plant-based diet, but what happens when people are just told to eat a plant-based diet, and how much they comply is up to them, which makes the results even more astounding. Check this out. The dashed line is the standard diet group. The solid line is the semi-veg. 200 days into the study, all the patients told to eat more of a plant-based diet are still in remission, but about 20% of the group not told to eat anything different relapsed. After a year, 100% of the semi-veg group still symptom-free, but the disease reemerged in half of the standard diet group. And at the end of 2 years, 92% of the patients told to eat a more plant-based diet remained without disease, whereas the majority of those not given that advice relapsed back into cycles of drugs, hospitalizations, and surgery. A highly significant finding. And that horrible relapse rate is typical on typical diets. Most Crohn's sufferers relapse within a year or two. Yet, the semi-vegetarian diet was highly effective in preventing relapse in Crohn's disease. Remission rate, meaning disease-free status, with a semi-vegetarian diet was 100% at 1 year and 92% at 2 years. This is the best result in relapse prevention. To the best of the researchers' knowledge, this is the best result in relapse prevention ever reported. The anti-inflammatory effect of plant-based diets is more than just about the power of plants, but also the avoidance of animal foods. We've known for 15 years that a single meal high in animal fat, sausage and egg McMuffins were used in the original landmark study, can cause an immediate elevation in inflammation within our bodies that peaks at about 4 hours. Remember the whole endothelial dysfunction story, where you can hook up people to a device that can measure the natural dilation of their arteries and blood flow through ultrasound? So, as you can see here, within hours of eating animal fat, our arteries get paralyzed. We nearly cut their ability to open normally in half. And that's not just happening in our arm. The lining of our whole vascular tree gets inflamed, stiffened, crippled, from just one meal. And just as things start to calm down, 5 or 6 hours later, we may whack our arteries with another load of meat, eggs, or dairy for lunch, such that most of our lives we're stuck in this chronic low-grade inflammation danger zone, which may set us up for inflammatory diseases such as heart disease, diabetes, cancer, kind of one meal at a time. Does the same thing happen in our lungs? Yes, again, after just hours, inflammation in our airways, a single meal with animal fat, causing internal damage, not just decades down the road, but right then and there, that day. What exactly is causing the inflammation, though? Well, what is inflammation? It's an immune response to a perceived threat. What's the body attacking, though? Well, at first, like in arthritis, scientists thought it might be the animal proteins triggering inflammation, which the body might see as an invader, whereas the reason plant foods don't trigger inflammation was thought to be because the body doesn't consider plants a threat. But you can get the same jolt of inflammation just eating whipped cream. There isn't a lot of protein in whipped cream, so attention turned to the fat, the saturated animal fat, butterfat, or lard, tallow, chicken fat. But that still doesn't answer the original question. What is the body attacking? Our immune system doesn't attack just fat, so they dug deeper, analyzing people's blood before and after the meal, and found something extraordinary. After a meal of animal products, people suffer from endotoxemia. Their bloodstream becomes awash with bacterial toxins known as endotoxins. OK, well, that certainly explains the inflammation. We've evolved to be acutely sensitive to bacterial invasion, and with this much endotoxin flooding into our system after a meal, our immune system must feel it's under assault. OK, but where are the endotoxins coming from? Well, the researchers knew endotoxins come from bacteria, and they figured, hey, where is there bacteria? In the gut. Right? So maybe animal fat causes our gut lining to become leaky and allow our own bacteria to slip into our bloodstream and cause the inflammation every time we eat. And indeed, that's what they found in mice. You feed them lard and their guts get leaky, and so for years the prevailing theory has been that saturated fats increase the permeability of intestinal lining, and that contributes to the breakdown of the intestinal barrier. But is that true in people? To recap, until recently, the thinking was that the reason that a single meal of animal foods causes inflammation is because animal foods have saturated fat. The saturated fat causes the breakdown of our intestinal barrier, which could cause a fat-induced translocation of small quantities of bacterial endotoxin from the gut into our bloodstreams, which triggers the acute inflammatory reaction associated with egg and sausage McMuffin consumption. So, to date, it's been widely considered that the source of this circulating endotoxin is the resident intestinal microflora. Wait a second, though. What's wrong with this picture? Look at the time scale. The rise of inflammation starts within just a few hours of ingestion. But where's our bacteria? Not in our small intestine, but 20 feet farther down in our large intestine. It could take like 8 hours for a McMuffin to get down there. So what's going on? Where else could bacterial endotoxins be coming from if not the bacteria in our gut? Maybe the endotoxins are coming from the food itself. This is the new study that changed everything. For the first time ever, they aimed to determine whether common foodstuffs may contain appreciable quantities of endotoxin. 40 extracts were therefore prepared from 27 foodstuffs common to the Western diet, and the capacity of each to induce the secretion of inflammatory signals from human white blood cells was measured. They found whopping doses of endotoxin equivalents in some pork, poultry, dairy, and chocolate products. What's with the chocolate? Well, the first step in chocolate making is bacterial fermentation of the beans. But thankfully, the phytonutrients, the plant-based nutrients, outweigh the effect of the bacteria and decrease inflammation overall. The same cannot be said for animal products, though. These findings of inflammatory compounds in animal foods and fermented foods therefore suggest that apparently unspoiled foodstuffs may nevertheless contain at some point in their preparation and processing a sufficient microbial load to release endotoxin receptor stimulants into their growth environment. This notion is supported by many previous studies showing that certain commonly consumed foodstuffs can contain a high bacterial load before cooking, such as fresh hamburger, which has often been shown to contain approximately 100 million bacteria per quarter pounder. Notably, however, the purpose of the present study was not to examine the microbial quality of each foodstuff, since the pathogen-associated molecular pattern, biological activity, is retained independently of bacterial viability or cooking, meaning the bacteria can be dead, the bacteria can be cooked, but their endotoxins are still there. You can boil meat for 2 hours straight, dip it in an acid bath, like our stomach, and expose it to digestive enzymes. Bacterial endotoxins were found to survive both cooking and our body's best attempts at acid and enzyme digestion. This led them to speculate that the occasional ingestion of meals high in bacterial endotoxins could promote transient mild systemic inflammatory episodes that predispose subjects to the development of atherosclerosis and insulin resistance, which can lead to diabetes. The animal fat may play a profound role in the pathogenesis of this after-meal inflammation by increasing the absorption of the endotoxins. That's where the animal fat comes in, since endotoxin has a strong affinity for the saturated fat transport system through the gut wall and into the bloodstream. So animal fat may play a role in boosting endotoxin absorption, but the primary reason all those studies show increased inflammation from animal foods, but not from most plant foods, may be the load of dead bacteria in animal products, which release endotoxins that are absorbed into our system, leading to the endotoxic inflammation we see after meat, egg, and dairy consumption as well. So, now that we know what's going on, what do? From a 2012 follow-up, well, the most obvious solution to this metabolic endotoxemia appears to be to reduce saturated fat intake, which in the US is mostly from cheese and chicken. But the researchers fear the Western diet is not conducive to this mode of action. It's difficult for patients to comply with this request. The same leaves of the same plant are used to make white, green oolong, and black tea. The primary difference is how they're processed, with white being the least processed and black being the most. In one of the videos I made a few years ago, I talked about how the tea with the most antioxidant power was green tea, unless you added lemon, in which case white tea pulls ahead. But what about going a step further and testing their respective abilities to prevent DNA damage? Previous studies have shown that the degree of protection against DNA damage from tea appeared to be related to the extent of processing, since green tea was generally more effective than black tea. This suggests the possibility that higher anti-mutagenic or anti-carcinogenic activity might be expected from teas that have undergone the least amount of processing. So They compared the anti-mutagenic activity of white tea in comparison with green tea. Bacteria, just like every other living creature, uses the same DNA that we do. So one common test to see if something is carcinogenic is to drip it on Salmonella growing in a petri dish and see if it causes DNA mutations. And to test if something protects DNA, you add it along with the carcinogen and see if there are fewer mutations. The carcinogen they picked for this test was a doozy. 2-amino-1-methyl-6-phenylamidazole-4,5-B pyridine, a heterocyclic amine found mostly in grilled, fried, and broiled chicken, added with green tea or white tea to see what would happen. Here's with the green tea. By dripping on green tea, you could drop the number of DNA mutations caused by the carcinogen by more than a half. But here's the white. Appeared to completely, 100% block the DNA damage, and the longer you brew it, the better. This is against another cooked meat carcinogen. You'll often see a recommendation to only brew white tea 1 or 2 minutes, but if you go out to 5, you can get significantly more DNA protection. For years, I've recommended that the healthiest beverage to drink is tea, even healthier than water, since tea is all the water of water, yet as a bonus carries a huge load of nutrition without adding calories. But there's a belief that caffeinated drinks, such as tea, may adversely affect hydration. Now, this was based on experiments done with high-dose caffeine pills, though, which may not entirely reflect the likely impact of tea, which is a more complex substance. So researchers compared 4 cups of black tea to 4 cups of water, and 6 cups of black tea to 6 cups of water. Kept volunteers locked up for 24 hours so could measure every drop going in and every drop coming out. The test revealed no significant differences between tea and water for any of the average blood or urine measurements. It was concluded that black tea and the amounts studied offered similar hydrating properties to water. Thus, tea could be considered a healthy choice of beverages, and health professionals that don't know any better and incorrectly identify tea as a diuretic could be misleading people and serve to drive consumption towards less healthy beverages. Gorlin syndrome, also known as basal cell nevus syndrome, is a genetic condition affecting about 1 in every 100,000 births, and which had become covered in skin cancers. Tragic disease, but a case report was recently published in the Journal of the European Academy of Dermatology, describing the temporary arrest of basal cell carcinoma formation in a patient with the syndrome. The poor woman was getting up to 20 new basal cell carcinomas every 6 months. Then she started going to a spa and getting green tea body wraps once a month, and for the following year, not a single new carcinoma appeared. Instead of 40, there were 0. But she ended up stopping after a year, and at her next dermatology visit, 15 new lesions had already started appearing. They assume it was the green tea, but the wrap also contained algae, mustard oil, ginger, calendula, so who knows. Now, the researchers emphasize this is but a single case report, and that it's not like there's enough evidence to start clinical treatment of human patients with non-melanoma skin cancer, because we lack the studies. But why not? Obviously, if there were risks, right, you wouldn't want someone to just start something based on one report. But what's the downside of giving it a try? There's a new treatment for genital warts. Has a fancy brand name for marketing purposes, but it's basically just green tea in ointment form. It was tried on 1,000 men and women, and complete clearance of all external genital warts was obtained in more than half the patients with a 10 or 15% green tea phytonutrient ointment. Such astounding results that it's been officially incorporated into the latest STD treatment guidelines from the Centers for Disease Control. And I bring this up as an illustration of the potential power of plants, like the tea plant, even when just smeared on our skin. As a physician, I care less about the strains of HPV that cause warts and more about the HPV that causes death. We know green tea consumption is associated with lower risk of certain gynecological cancers, ovarian, endothelial, but what about the HPV-related cervical, vaginal, and vulva cancers? Well, a recent in vitro study looking at 2 different lines of cervical cancer cells found that green tea phytonutrients appear to open cans of cancer whoop-ass, but in terms of diet, what's important is that the phytonutrients in green tea appear protective not only when applied topically to cervical lesions, but orally as well, suggesting that high consumption of green tea could either reduce the incidence of cervical cancer or delay the progression of precancerous lesions to cervical cancer. Our kidneys are highly vascular organs. That's why they look so red inside. After all, our 2 little kidneys have to filter through our entire blood supply, and as such, receive about 20% of our cardiac output every time our heart contracts. And so if the standard American diet is so toxic to the blood vessels in our heart, brain, and pelvis, leading to heart attack, stroke, and sexual dysfunction, what might it be doing to our kidneys? Researchers at Harvard recently put that question to the test. Thousands of women and their diets and their kidney function were followed for a decade. What they're looking for is the presence of protein in the urine, known as microalbuminuria. There's not supposed to be any protein in our urine. The whole point of our kidneys is to keep the good stuff in our blood and get rid of the bad. It's supposed to hold on to protein, and if it doesn't, that's a sign our kidneys are starting to fail. There were 3 significant risk factors for declining kidney function in these women, none of which come as a surprise, given that we're talking about clogged and inflamed blood vessels. Specifically, diets higher in animal protein, animal fat, and cholesterol may be associated with microalbuminuria, failing kidneys. No such association was found for plant protein, or plant fat. And microalbuminuria is a kind of canary in a coal mine, telling you there's something definitely wrong with your blood vessels. Microalbuminuria and modest decrements in kidney function are powerfully associated with subsequent overt kidney disease, cardiovascular risk, and all-cause mortality, meaning a shortened lifespan. In summary, diets lower in animal protein, animal fat, and cholesterol may be protective against this kidney damage. One of the most important functions of our kidneys is to filter out excess phosphorus from our bloodstream. And so when our kidney function declines, phosphorus can build up in our bodies and cause something called metastatic calcification, where your heart valves and muscles and other parts of your body can build up calcium deposits, and eventually result in skin necrosis, gangrene, amputations, all sorts of bad stuff. So if a person has diminished kidney function, their doctor will likely put them on a low-phosphate diet, which is tough, because basically everything with protein has phosphorus. So both plant foods and animal foods have phosphorus. But when omnivores have been compared to those eating vegan, vegans had significantly less protein leaking out into their urine, a sign of intact kidney function. So they concluded that these results can confirm the usefulness of vegetarianism here and support the use of a vegan diet for patients with kidney failure. Maybe it was just because the omnivores were getting a higher protein load, and we know that lower protein diets appear to delay the progression of kidney failure. So did the plant-based diet help because they were eating less protein, or because the body somehow is able to handle plant protein better than animal protein? Now, to figure that out, you'd have to split people into 2 groups, half on a vegetarian diet, half not, with the critical caveat to make sure both groups eat the exact same amount of protein and the exact same amount of phosphorus. And that's what researchers did. Published recently in the Journal of the American Society of Nephrology, they took vegetarians and put them on a meat diet, and then took meat eaters and put them on a vegetarian diet. Even though phosphorus and protein intake were kept the same in both diet groups, here's the level of phosphorus stuck in the bloodstream of those on the meat diet compared to those on the veg diet. So there's just something about plant foods that enables our bodies to better handle their phosphorus content. Same amount of phosphorus, but plant phosphorus appears easier to cleanse away from our body. Positive results have been seen even with semi-vegetarian diets, but the reason the new study observed more dramatic differences after only 1 week was perhaps because the pure vegetarian diets used in this study. Taken together, a vegetarian-based diet may be beneficial for the control of phosphorus balance in patients with chronic kidney disease. An estimated 10 to 20% of the general population suffers from irritable bowel syndrome, accounting for about 4 million doctor visits a year. What can we do for people? Well, how about a kiwi fruit intervention? Kiwi fruit improves bowel function in patients with irritable bowel syndrome with constipation. Thankfully, in English too. The impact of a 4-week kiwi fruit intervention on bowel function in patients diagnosed with irritable bowel with constipation. 2 kiwis a day for a month in this study, funded by, of course, the world's largest marketer of kiwis. I'm surprised they didn't have them eating 5 a day. But they did find that such a kiwi intervention shortens colon transit time, increases defecation frequency, and improves bowel function. Furthermore, no deleterious effects of kiwi fruit consumption on psychological functioning or adverse effects were found in these studies. I would hope not. But what they're hinting at, though, is Tegaserod, the most frequently prescribed drug for irritable bowel, until it was pulled from the market out of concern it was killing people, increasing risk of heart attack and stroke. So I'd stick with the kiwis. In 2003, a landmark study was published in the journal Carcinogenesis. Now, we've known plant-based diets rich in fruits and vegetables can prevent development of several chronic age-related diseases, including cancer. But why? Well, the mechanism behind this protective effect is not clear. We know whole plant foods are rich in antioxidants, which are capable of decreasing oxidative damage to DNA, and thus might prevent mutation in cancer. But what about our second line of defense against oxidative DNA damage, DNA repair? We're going to get some DNA damage in our world, no matter how healthy our diet, so it's critical to find ways to upregulate our DNA repair enzymes to better assist with stitching our DNA back together again. So, how about we give people some kiwi fruits, on and off for a few weeks, and see what happens? Why kiwi fruits? Because it was funded by the International Kiwi Fruit Association. You got to get funding from somewhere. First, what happened to the level of DNA damage? Each symbol represents the DNA damage measured in one person. So day 0, no kiwi fruit. The WO means without kiwi fruit. And you can see they start out all over the map, right? Maybe some were smokers or sat in traffic, who knows. But then, here they go on 1 kiwi a day. Then they go back to 0, then 2 a day, then 0, then 3 kiwis a day. Now, it wasn't completely consistent on every day for every person, but you can kind of get a sense that, the times without the kiwi fruits, DNA damage tended to go up, and indeed that's what the statistical analysis found, significantly less DNA damage on the days they were eating kiwi fruits. Note that it didn't seem to matter how many kiwis they were eating, though, right? They seemed to get the same benefit whether they were eating 1 or 3. Kiwi fruits have antioxidants, so no wonder there was less DNA damage. But once you already have DNA damage, can kiwi fruit help with DNA restoration? So this is our first line of defense, right? The antioxidants in plant foods. Now on to our second line of defense, DNA repair. This is measuring DNA repair rates, level of DNA repair off kiwis, on kiwis, off kiwis, on 2 kiwis, off kiwis, on 3. Now, although it appears the 3 kiwis did better than 1 or 2, statistically all 3 kiwi doses appeared pretty much the same, suggesting there's some sort of plateau effect. Maybe there's just some phytonutrient in kiwis that boosts this DNA repair enzyme system, and it's just really a matter of whether or not you have it in your bloodstream, rather than how much of it is there. What would be interesting is if you added a different fruit or vegetable on top of the kiwi, with a whole different portfolio of phytonutrients. Would they complement one another, or would it just be a plateau across the board? We didn't find out until recently. To recap, the traditional model of how fruits and vegetables protect against cancer is that their antioxidants prevent the buildup of free radicals, also known as reactive oxygen species, ROS, which would otherwise go on to damage our cellular DNA, membranes, etc., which could lead to the transformation of healthy cells into damaged, diseased, or dying cells. But in that landmark 2003 kiwi fruit study, we learned that there's a second pathway as well. Phytonutrients actually modulate gene expression and can increase our cellular defenses, such that even if there is some damage to our DNA, our cells may recover instead of being irreparably lost. The kiwi study looked at one of those defenses, one DNA repair enzyme, but there are many ways our cells repair our DNA. We don't mess around when it comes to protecting our genes. So question number one, what effect does kiwi fruit consumption have on all these other defenses? And question number two, what if we branch out and test multiple fruits and veggies at the same time? You'll remember that there did not seem to be a dose response with the kiwis, right? As far as this DNA repair enzyme was concerned, you were either eating kiwis or not. It didn't really matter how many. But man cannot live on kiwis alone. What if you did a mix of fruits and veggies? Could we break through that ceiling? Now, studies are expensive, particularly if the kiwi people refuse funding because you have the audacity to test other fruit. So they wanted to make this study count. So when they designed their plant portfolio, they went all out. Check it out. Green tea, rosehip juice, berries, 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 pomegranate, dark blue grapes, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, red cabbage, kale, blue potatoes, dark chocolate, walnuts, rosemary, oregano. This study is making me hungry. I don't know if you noticed, but this is that same amazing research group that blessed the world with that study of thousands of different foods, so they knew what they were doing. OK, long story short, plant-based diets can prevent development of several chronic age-related diseases, blah, blah, blah. We know that. Yes, but how, and what about that plateau effect? This is what they did. 3 groups. The antioxidants to the teeth group compared to the 3 kiwi a day group compared to control. Took blood from everyone, and then, for the first time ever reported, did this microarray analysis where you can measure the effects of a plant-based diet on expression of hundreds of different genes at a time. The first to investigate the influences of healthy diets on gene expression in whole blood. This was the study. All right, well, the kiwi group was able to significantly regulate not just one gene, as I showed in the 2003 study, but a total of 5. Meanwhile, the very berry group significantly regulated 5 times more, 25 genes. Conclusion: the observed changes in blood cell gene expression profiles suggest that the beneficial effects of a plant-based diet on human health may be mediated through optimization of defense processes. The Harvard Nurses' Health Study, involving more than 100,000 women, was started in 1976, and so, as you can imagine, is now the most definitive long-term study ever on older women's health. Since the study started, thousands of participants have died, and now, thanks to all that hard work, though, 35 years later, they published the Risk Factors for Mortality. And because it was a so-called competing risks analysis, it allows one to compare different risks to one another. The #1 single cause of death? Heart disease. And so no surprise that dietary cholesterol consumption was a significant risk factor for death. The second leading cause of death was smoking-related cancer deaths. Comparing the two, consuming the amount of cholesterol found in just a single egg a day appears to cut a woman's life short as much as smoking 5 cigarettes a day for 15 years. The most protective behavior they found was fiber consumption. Eating just a cup of oatmeal's worth of fiber a day appears to extend a woman's life as much as 4 hours of jogging a week. But of course, there's no reason you can't do both. The one specific food most tied to longevity was nuts. You appear to also get 4 hours of weekly jogging benefit eating just 2 handfuls of nuts a week as well. Taking a step back, though, it's worth noting that the intake of cholesterol, only found in animal foods, was associated with living a shorter life, and the intake of fiber, only found in plant foods, was associated with living a longer life. A disturbing analysis of mortality and morbidity was recently published in the Journal of Gerontology. Are we living longer? Yes. But are those extra healthy years? No, and it's worse than that. We're actually living fewer healthy years than we used to. A 20-year-old woman in 1998 could expect to live about 60 more years, whereas a 20-year-old in 2006 could look forward to 61 more years. So we gained a year. Great. And same with men. That 20-year-old in the 90s, though, would only live about 10 or 11 of those years with a serious disease, whereas closer to now, it's more like 12 or 13 with a serious disease. So we live a year longer, but we come down with a serious disease, like stroke, cancer, diabetes, 2 years earlier. So it's like 1 step forward, 2 steps back. They also measured one's ability to function. In the study, you were considered disabled if you couldn't walk a quarter mile, couldn't walk up 10 steps, couldn't stand or sit for 2 hours without having to lie down, or couldn't stand, bend, or kneel without using special equipment. Using those criteria, we live 1 year longer, but in less than just 1 decade, we not only have more years with serious disease, but more years unable to function. So we're living longer in sickness, not in health, a longer lifespan, but shorter health span. Why can't we live forever? Some animals do. And I'm not talking about some 200-year-old whale or even a 1,000-year-old tree. I'm talking about immortal. There are actually species that apparently don't age and could technically go on forever. And why not? I mean, in a sense, humans are immortal in that a few of our cells live on, sperm or egg cells lucky enough to find each other. Each of our kids grow out of one of our cells, and that alone, I mean, the fact that a single cell can grow into a person should make, in comparison, the notion of keeping our bodies going indefinitely seem biologically trivial. Well, it's certainly a hot research topic. Much is focused on the role of DHEA, dihydroepiandrosterone, the most abundant steroid hormone in the human body, whose levels drop significantly as we age. It is a cortisol antagonist, meaning that it helps counteract the effects of stress. It appears to rejuvenate female fertility, and most importantly, appears to be a strong predictor of longevity. In fact, one of the ways caloric restriction appears to extend the lifespan of many animals may be the upregulation of DHEA. So, no surprise, it is sold as a fountain of youth over-the-counter supplement, raising all sorts of concerns about safety, side effects, and the lack of quality control in this increasingly financially rewarding business. For example, some supplements just totally lie and have no DHEA in them, and others have significantly more than the claimed dose. And so for this and other reasons, taking DHEA supplements is recommended against. But are there natural ways to boost levels of this hormone? Well, we've known a number of individual dietary components like fiber intake are associated with better levels, so why not just put all the dietary components together? Short-term impact of a lacto-vegetarian diet. So after just 5 days on an egg-free vegetarian diet, blood levels of DHEA rose about 20% compared to the meaty diets. And it's interesting why. It wasn't necessarily because they were making more, producing more of it, but instead they were losing less. The bodies of those eating vegetarian appear to hold on to it, which is normally something you only see in fasting. But these were all isocaloric diets, meaning same calories in both diets. So by eating vegetarian, one may be able to mimic the effects of caloric restriction, but without walking around starving all the time. According to the Swine Information Center, pork is an excellent source of a number of nutrients, including iron and zinc. When you see on a label that something or other is a quote-unquote good source of some nutrient, that's actually a legal definition, meaning it has to have at least 10% of the daily value of that particular nutrient. It says nothing about the excellence of the food source itself. So, for example, you could throw a multivitamin into a scoop of sewer sludge and legally call it a good source of half a dozen things, but it would probably kill you. It's not good at all. It always comes back to food as a package deal. It is impossible to get the calcium in dairy, for example, without also getting the hormones, or the iron in beef without the saturated fat. So these aren't necessarily good sources of nutrients after all, because we can't get one without the other, unless we get our nutrients from non-animal sources. Then we don't have to worry about the saturated animal fat, cholesterol, and the rest. And there's a bonus that comes when we get, for example, our iron and zinc from whole grains, greens, beans, nuts, and seeds, the fiber, folate, phytonutrients, etc. It's a package deal, but in a good way. It's like, order now and get a free gift. One of those phytonutrients, though, phytates, or phytic acid, from the Greek word phyton, meaning plant, can partially inhibit mineral absorption. Now, phytates are actually good for us. They have a wide range of health-promoting properties, such as anti-cancer activity. But because it binds up some of the minerals, that just means one has to eat more whole, healthy plant foods, or eat mineral absorption enhancers, such as garlic and onions. In fact, the whole allium family of vegetables was recently found to have promoting influences on the bioaccessibility of iron and zinc. Here's the bioaccessibility of iron and zinc in a serving of brown rice, cooked with 1 clove of garlic, cooked with 2 cloves of garlic. We see the same thing with onions. Here's normalized data for brown rice plain, then eaten at the same meal with 1 thin slice of onion, or 2 thin slices of onion. So up to 50% more absorption. But if you don't like garlic and onions, then you can get the same mineral absorption from just eating a whole grain serving and a half. Iron is a double-edged sword. If we don't absorb enough, we risk anemia, but if we absorb too much, we may be increasing our risk of colorectal cancer, heart disease, infection, neurodegenerative disorders, and inflammatory conditions. Other conditions that have been associated with high iron intake include Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, arthritis, diabetes. Because the human body has no mechanism to rid itself of excess iron, we evolved to tightly regulate the absorption of iron. If our iron stores are low, our intestines boost the absorption of iron, and if our iron stores are topped off, our intestines block the absorption of iron to maintain us in that sweet spot. But this only works with the primary source of iron in the human diet, the iron found in plant foods. Our digestive system cannot regulate the iron in ingested blood, heme iron. The iron in animal foods can just zip right through our intestinal barrier, even if we already have too much in our system. We have no control over it. In fact, just some guess that iron overload may be a reason meat consumption has been tied to breast cancer risk. Iron is a pro-oxidant, and can induce oxidative stress and DNA damage. A high intake of iron in developed societies may over time lead to a physiologic state of iron overload in postmenopausal women who are no longer losing blood every month. Iron overload favors the production of free radicals, fat oxidation, DNA damage, and may contribute to breast cancer development, carcinogenesis, independently or potentiating the effects of other carcinogens. Only people with a confirmed diagnosis of iron deficiency anemia should consider supplementing their iron intake, and even then it can be risky. A recent study found that a significant increase in oxidative stress happened within the bodies of women on iron supplements. And so before going on iron supplements, I would suggest talking to your physician about first trying to treat it through diet alone. by eating lots of healthy iron-rich foods like chickpeas and pumpkin seeds, while consuming vitamin C-rich foods at the same meal, such as citrus, tropical fruits, broccoli, bell peppers, which improve plant iron absorption, while at the same time avoiding drinking tea and coffee with your meals, which can impair iron absorption. Since organic acids, like vitamin C, can boost iron absorption, the Coca-Cola Company commissioned a study to see if drinking Coke would do the same thing, and the answer is no. In a language of certainty rarely seen in the medical literature, all studies conclude that nuts can play an important role as a part of a healthy diet in order to minimize cardiovascular risk and obtain multiple health benefits. What could possibly be in nuts that appears to so powerfully cut heart disease risk? By about a third on average. The clue is that the reduction in total coronary heart disease death associated with nut consumption was due primarily to a decrease in sudden cardiac death. To review, more than half of all heart disease deaths are sudden, and most patients who suffer sudden cardiac death are not considered at high risk on the basis of established criteria, and up to 55% of men, 68% of women, have no clinically recognized heart disease before sudden death. Of course, they obviously had rampant heart disease, it just wasn't recognized until they were lying in the morgue. So, if there was ever a case to be made for primary prevention, starting to eat healthier right now, tonight, before symptoms arise, sudden cardiac death is it, since our first symptom is often our last. OK, so how do we do it? Our story begins 43 years ago with a fascinating paper in the New England Journal, Sudden Death and Ischemic Heart Disease, Correlation with Hardness of the Local Water Supply. There appeared to be an increased susceptibility to lethal arrhythmias, fatal heart rhythms, among residents of soft water areas. So maybe one of the minerals found in hard water is protective. But which one? Well, let's cut some hearts open and find out. Differences in metal content of the heart muscle in death from ischemic heart disease. On autopsy, the hearts of sudden cardiac death victims have significantly lower magnesium concentrations compared to people that just got hit by a bus or something. So, maybe there's a connection, but it wasn't put to the test until recently. Why the decades-long delay in testing a potentially cheap, simple way to help prevent our #1 killer? That's exactly the problem. Cheap. Where's magnesium found? Whole grains, greens, beans, nuts and seeds. Who's going to fund the study? The pumpkin seed lobby? Big spinach? If magnesium was found to be protective, who's going to profit? Who's going to benefit? Other, of course, than the hundreds of thousands of Americans that keel over dead every year without even being able to say goodbye to their families. Despite the promising autopsy and ecologic, meaning population data, that I just covered, supporting a specific association between low magnesium levels and sudden cardiac death, there's only been 2 studies prospectively examining the association. This one from the Harvard Nurses Study, published in 2011, and this one from 2010, the Atherosclerosis Risk in Communities Study, covering a multi-ethnic population of thousands of men and women. High blood levels of magnesium were associated with an almost 40% reduced risk of sudden cardiac death. And women in the highest compared with the lowest quarter of dietary and blood magnesium had a 34% and 77% lower risk of sudden cardiac death, respectively. Another 2011 study noting magnesium is an essential mineral in whole grains, leafy green vegetables, legumes, meaning beans, peas, lentils, and soy, and nuts, as well as seeds, that acts as a cofactor in hundreds of enzymatic reactions in the human body. A considerable body of evidence indicates that a higher intake of dietary magnesium may favorably affect a cluster of metabolic and inflammatory disorders, including many of our top killers like diabetes and heart disease. So, Did they put a whole bunch of people on whole grains, beans, greens, and nuts? No, they gave them a pill. A randomized, double-blind, controlled crossover trial, and indeed, magnesium pills did improve some biomarkers in the bodies of the overweight individuals studied. But come on. In fact, even the Harvard nurses study threw up their hands in defeat, since most Americans do not meet the RDA, even taking pills. Therefore, we need more pills, and put it in the water supply and start fortifying foods. I mean, there's no way, apparently, that Americans are going to start eating spinach or something. It's true, though, that most Americans eat so poorly that they don't even get the measly recommended daily intake. This is the daily value for magnesium, 400. This is how much the average American gets. How much do you think the average American vegetarian gets? Well, recently published in the Journal of the American Dietetics Association, a vegetarian dietary pattern as a nutrient-dense approach to weight management. They measured vegetarian magnesium intake, and they're not eating their greens either. Non-vegetarians ate an average of 0.1 cups of dark green leafy vegetables a day. The vegetarians ate 0.15 cups. They did better, but still, not enough greens, beans, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. It's not enough to eat a plant-based diet. We need to eat a healthy plant-based diet. Thank you so much for watching and your interest in my work. If any questions have arisen while watching this, please go to nutritionfacts.org, post the question, and I will do my best to answer it.